When historians describe Iowa in 1856, they usually focus on what was happening above ground: westward expansion, new settlements springing up along the frontier, and pioneer communities building their first permanent structures. But the real story, the one that barely made it past a single newspaper article, the one that even today sits buried in archival footnotes, began below the surface. It started with a simple construction order. Workmen were instructed to excavate a cellar for Governor Grimes's new building on the corner of Main and Valley Streets. The goal was straightforward: dig the foundation, prepare the ground, and ready the site for construction. But the moment workers began breaking through the Iowa soil, something unexpected happened. They struck something solid that shouldn't have been there. They broke through a layer that hadn't been exposed in living memory. Beneath the prairie earth, at a depth that made no sense for natural formation, the crews found an arched vault approximately 10 feet square. Its construction was unusual. Its purpose was unclear. And what lay inside didn't match anything in the settlement records of Iowa Territory. This wasn't supposed to exist there. The newspaper reported it once, a brief mention in the local press, matter of fact, almost casual. But in the weeks that followed, something strange occurred. The story vanished. No follow-up articles, no scientific examination, no official investigation. Just silence. The official explanation, when anyone bothered to offer one, would later dismiss all of this as a misidentification, perhaps Native American remains, or simply exaggerated frontier tales. Nothing unusual, nothing worth preserving. But the original newspaper account from 1856, the one that still exists in a handful of archives, tells something different. It describes workmen standing at the edge of a vault built with 14-inch thick walls, laid up with cement or some other indestructible mortar, a construction method that didn't match anything pioneers were building in 1856 Iowa. And inside that vault, 8 human skeletons, not ordinary remains, skeletons of gigantic proportions measuring approximately 8 to 10 feet in length, described as the largest remains ever found. And the deeper you examine what happened next, the more the story stops looking like a simple archaeological discovery, and more like evidence that was systematically buried, hidden, and deliberately forgotten. At first, the construction crew tried to understand what they had found in the simplest way possible. Perhaps it was an old storage vault, maybe even a burial chamber from an earlier settlement they didn't know about. But as they cleared more earth and exposed the full structure, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why was there a vault at all beneath virgin Iowa prairie? Why was it constructed with such permanence, with walls 14 inches thick and mortar that the workmen described as indestructible? Why was it arched, a sophisticated construction technique that required engineering knowledge far beyond simple burial practices? And the question that troubled even the most practical frontiersmen: why were the remains inside so enormous? Iowa in 1856 was barely settled. The territory had only achieved statehood a decade earlier. Yet the vault beneath Governor Grimes's construction site appeared built for occupants far larger than any known human population. The newspaper account makes this clear. 8 skeletons, all of gigantic proportions, all in a good state of preservation, all approximately 8 to 10 feet in length. Workers quietly admitted among themselves that nothing about this discovery lined up with their understanding of who had lived on this land before them. And although none of them were using terms like lost race or ancient giants, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone of extraordinary size had been buried here with great care, in a structure built to last far longer than any wooden coffin or simple grave. When the excavation crew fully exposed the vault beneath Main and Valley Streets, what they uncovered didn't behave the way a normal burial site is supposed to behave. This wasn't a simple hole dug in the ground. This was engineered architecture. The first anomaly was the arch itself. Arch construction requires precise measurement, careful stone or brick placement, and an understanding of load distribution. It's not a technique you use for a quick burial. It's a technique you use when you're building something meant to endure for centuries, Yet here it was, buried beneath Iowa prairie, in a location where no permanent settlement was supposed to exist. The walls were 14 inches thick. That's not a burial vault, that's fortress construction. That's the kind of thickness you build when you're trying to protect something from immense pressure, from the weight of earth above, from time itself. And the mortar. The workmen described it as indestructible. Not crumbling, not weakened by moisture or frost. Indestructible. That suggests a binding agent far more advanced than anything frontier Iowa possessed in 1856. That suggests knowledge of chemistry, of material science, of construction techniques that don't appear in any record of who built on that ground. As the workers carefully entered the vault, the dimensions became clearer. 10 feet square, 6 feet deep from the base of the arch, large enough to hold 8 enormous skeletons arranged with care, preserved with intention. This wasn't a mass grave from war or disease. This was a purposeful burial chamber, constructed by people who understood engineering and who had a reason to build something permanent. And then came the discovery that still generates debate today. The skeletons themselves. 8 individuals, all of gigantic proportions, all measuring approximately 8 to 10 feet in length. The newspaper account makes no attempt to sensationalize this. It states it plainly, almost clinically, the largest remains ever found. Officially, conventional archaeology later dismissed such accounts as frontier exaggeration, misidentified animal bones, or simply hoaxes. But nothing about the 1856 Iowa discovery fits that pattern. This wasn't a lone skeleton found by an unreliable witness. This was 8 skeletons discovered by multiple workmen, examined by enough people that a newspaper felt confident reporting specific measurements. The remains were described as being in a good state of preservation. That's significant. It means the vault had succeeded in its apparent purpose, to protect its occupants from decay, from the elements, from the passage of time. The engineering worked. Whatever civilization built that chamber knew exactly what they were doing. But here's what makes the Iowa discovery especially troubling for conventional narratives. These weren't scattered bones, they were complete skeletons laid out with clear intention, preserved with obvious care. This was a formal burial conducted by a society that had the resources, the knowledge, and the motivation to construct permanent architecture for their dead. And if the measurements are accurate, if these remains truly range from 8 to 10 feet in length, then we're looking at evidence of a human population that doesn't fit anywhere in the accepted timeline of North American history. As news of the discovery should have spread, something peculiar began happening. The story didn't grow. It contracted. No scientific expeditions arrived to study the vault. No Smithsonian representatives came to collect the remains. No follow-up articles appeared describing what happened to the skeletons or the structure that held them. Instead, the discovery simply faded from public record. The vault was presumably filled in as Governor Grimes's building went forward. The skeletons, if they were preserved at all, vanished into private collections or storage facilities that left no paper trail. Some of this might have been simple frontier practicality. Iowa in 1856 had no established archaeological institutions, no museums prepared to house such finds. But that doesn't explain why the discovery wasn't reported to Eastern scientific societies, why no detailed measurements were taken, why no photographs were made once that technology became available. The decisions about what to preserve and what to bury seemed to follow a pattern, because the discoveries that challenged accepted history most directly were the ones that disappeared the fastest. The enormous skeletons were never seen again. The indestructible vault was covered over. Even the newspaper account became a footnote, rarely cited, easily dismissed. What makes the Iowa Vault especially significant is that it wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the 1800s, across America, similar discoveries kept appearing in local newspapers, then vanishing from official records. Wisconsin, 1891. Investigators reported finding enormous burial mounds containing skeletons of unusual size. The remains were sent to Washington. They were never displayed, never studied publicly, never mentioned in any publications. Ohio, throughout the 1800s, dozens of newspaper accounts describe the opening of ancient mounds, revealing skeletons measuring 7 to 9 feet in length. Some included detailed descriptions of artifacts, copper ornaments, and sophisticated burial practices. Most of these finds disappeared within months of discovery. Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, the pattern repeats. Local discoveries, brief newspaper mentions, then silence. The remains vanish. The mounds are destroyed by farming or development. The evidence disappears before anyone can conduct systematic study. And when you map these discoveries, something disturbing becomes apparent. They cluster along river valleys near major waterways in locations that suggest a widespread population, not scattered anomalies. They appear in engineered burial structures, not simple graves. They show evidence of advanced metallurgy, sophisticated construction, and cultural practices that don't match any recognized Native American tradition. The conventional explanation, frontier exaggeration, misidentified mastodons, or hoaxes. But that explanation requires us to believe that hundreds of independent witnesses across multiple states over decades of time all made the same mistake, or all participated in the same conspiracy. It requires us to ignore the engineering evidence, the vault construction, the artifacts that accompanied the remains. What happened to the Iowa Giants and to hundreds of similar discoveries wasn't accidental neglect. It was systematic suppression. Not through conspiracy, but through institutional gatekeeping, through the quiet decisions of museums and universities about what evidence deserves study and what evidence can be safely ignored. When institutions were collecting artifacts throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, they had a clear narrative about American prehistory. Native Americans arrived via the Bering Land Bridge relatively recently. They developed in isolation from Old World civilizations. They built nothing permanent, nothing monumental, before European contact. Any discovery that challenged this narrative created a problem. Giant skeletons suggested a different population, a different timeline, a different story entirely. So those discoveries were archived in ways that made them difficult to access, stored in facilities where they wouldn't be displayed, or simply lost in the vast collections where they could be forgotten. This wasn't active destruction, it was passive erasure, the kind that happens when institutions decide certain questions aren't worth asking, certain evidence isn't worth preserving, certain chapters of history aren't worth telling. When you step back and examine what the Iowa discovery actually showed, independent of later dismissals and explanations, a clear pattern emerges. Sophisticated construction methods, permanent architecture, burial practices suggesting social organization and cultural complexity, and human remains of a size that doesn't fit conventional models. The vault itself demonstrated knowledge of engineering. The arch design requires understanding of force distribution. The 14-inch walls suggest experience with load-bearing construction. The indestructible mortar indicates advanced material science. None of this matches the temporary camps and seasonal settlements attributed to Iowa's pre-European inhabitants. The skeletons demonstrated something equally troubling for accepted timelines. If the measurements were accurate, we're looking at evidence of a human population averaging 8 to 10 feet in height, not individuals with gigantism, which would show skeletal deformities, but a population, multiple individuals, all of exceptional size, all buried together with clear cultural intention. And the preservation of the remains suggested that whoever built the vault succeeded in their goal. The bodies were protected, the chamber held, the engineering worked across what must have been centuries, possibly millennia, of burial. And this brings us to the question that no official archive, no textbook, no conventional history has ever answered satisfactorily. What happened to the 8 skeletons discovered in Iowa in 1856? Were they reburied when construction continued? Were they sent to some private collection? Were they deliberately destroyed to eliminate evidence that didn't fit the preferred narrative? We don't know, because no one in a position of institutional authority chose to create a clear record. Why was a sophisticated burial vault constructed beneath Iowa Prairie? Who had the engineering knowledge to build permanent architecture with arched ceilings and indestructible mortar? Why were 8 individuals of gigantic proportions buried together with such obvious care? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're evidence gaps that conventional archaeology has never adequately addressed, choosing instead to dismiss the entire category of giant discoveries rather than engage with the specific evidence each case presents. When you examine the Iowa discovery alongside hundreds of similar finds from the 1800s, a disturbing possibility emerges. What if North America was inhabited by a population we no longer acknowledge? What if that population built permanent structures, developed advanced construction techniques, and achieved a level of cultural sophistication that doesn't appear in our accepted timeline? What if the mounds scattered across the Midwest aren't simple burial hills, but the last visible remnants of architectural complexes that were systematically dismantled, ploughed under, and erased by European expansion? What if the giant skeletons aren't anomalies, but evidence of a distinct population that existed before, during, or alongside the ancestors of modern Native American tribes? The evidence for such a civilization exists, but it exists in fragments, newspaper accounts that were never followed up, museum collections that were never catalogued, discoveries that were buried again before systematic study could occur. It exists in the gaps, in the silences, in the questions that institutional archaeology chose not to ask. The workmen who discovered the Iowa Vault in 1856 had a choice. They could have stopped construction, called for scientific examination, preserved the structure and its contents for systematic study. Instead, they presumably filled it back in, continued building, and let the discovery fade into local folklore. This wasn't malicious, it was practical. Governor Grimes needed his building. The frontier economy didn't allow for archaeological delays, and in 1856 there was no framework for understanding what had been found, no institutions ready to preserve it, no narrative that could accommodate it. But what's harder to explain is why later generations didn't return to investigate. Why no archaeological team in the 1900s excavated the site to search for remaining evidence? Why the discovery remained a footnote rather than becoming a catalyst for deeper questions about Iowa's prehistory? The answer might be uncomfortable. Because if the Iowa giants were real, if the measurements were accurate, if the vault demonstrated advanced engineering, then the entire accepted story of North American prehistory begins to collapse. And sometimes it's easier to preserve a simple narrative than to acknowledge evidence that demands we completely rewrite our understanding of the past. And that brings us to the ultimate question of this investigation, a question no archive, no official publication, no mainstream historian has ever answered fully. Why were the giant discoveries systematically erased from history? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The enormous skeletons were lost, the sophisticated burial structures were filled in, the newspaper accounts were dismissed. The institutional evidence was archived in ways that made it inaccessible. And even the photographs, when they existed, vanished from collections or were explained away as hoaxes without proper forensic analysis. Almost as if the 1856 discovery and hundreds like it had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than accepted Native American chronology, more complex than the simple narrative of isolated tribes, more troubling than conventional archaeology wanted to address. For one brief moment in 1856, the earth beneath Iowa opened just enough to show it. 8 skeletons of gigantic proportions preserved in a vault that shouldn't exist, built by hands we can no longer identify. But instead of studying it, they covered it again, filled it, built over it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Iowa was home to a civilization of giants, then the real question isn't what was discovered in 1856, it's what else lies beneath the farmlands of America. What other vaults, what other burial chambers, what other evidence was quietly erased before the age of cameras and systematic archaeology? The Iowa giants weren't just an odd frontier discovery. They were a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never meant to see. And now that glimpse is your clue, your map, your invitation to question everything we think we know about who walked this continent before us. Because if this is what survived under one Iowa building site, imagine what still sleeps beneath the rest. Something out of place, something out of time, something they chose to bury rather than explain.